Join me, Sam McClure, and former Richmond superstar, that's former, Matthew Richardson, for a brand new podcast, Margin Call.
Every Wednesday, we'll look at what's bubbling away in the round ahead, casting our eyes over the teams, the big issues, and everything in between.
We won't have Yes No Richo, but there'll be plenty more to discuss as we get stuck into the 2023 AFL season.
Can we have a Tasmanian segment?
We'll have to discuss that one. Margin Call, out now. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Margin Call is brought to you by Tab. Download the app today. What are you really gambling with? For free and confidential support, visit gamblinghelponline.org.au.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, May 19.
And I say to my fellow Australians, thank you for this extraordinary honour.
On Monday, the Albanese government will have been in power for 1 year.
Tonight, the Australian people have voted for change.
When Prime Minister Anthony Albanese became Prime Minister, he made big promises. He pledged no one would be left behind and no one held back under his government, and that he would seek common purpose and promote unity among Australians.
And I have shared the two principles that will drive a government that I lead. No one left behind, because we should always look after the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. But also no one held back, because we should always support aspiration and opportunity. That is what my government will do.
So what exactly has his government achieved so far? Has Albanese lived up to the optimistic promise of his election night victory speech? And what upcoming problems are likely to bring the government's honeymoon period to an end? Today, political commentator and author Niki Savva and chief political correspondent David Crowe join me to discuss the Albanese government 1 year in. Welcome, David and Niki.
Good to be talking again, Jackie.
Great to be here. Thank you.
David, I want to start with you because you sat down with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, just a few days ago. What was that conversation like, and how does he reflect on the past year himself?
He reflects on the year in terms of specific things that he's done. Now, he's not a great one for sort of stopping and thinking and talking about his inner planning about everything that he's got in train. But he's got a long list of things that he says he's achieved. And also he's clearly got a lot of ambition for what he wants to do between now and the 2025 election. And it's all about cementing the gains that he's got in political terms, continuing some of his policy changes, and really locking in the support that he has clearly gained from people who voted Liberal at the last election, but he thinks will vote Labor at the next election. And this is really fundamental. I mean, when I ask him, what's your approach after 1 year in power, he says things like, look, any government shows its character in its first year. You know, the government has a sense of purpose, he says.
We have outlined clearly what we would do and then have set about putting that those plans in place. And I think we've taken the Australian people into our confidence as well by doing that.
So a big theme is not taking Australian voters by surprise, taking them with him on every step so that if there is change, he's brought the Australian people into his confidence. And so he's got their support when he goes to that 2025 election. And let's face it, given our polling in the Resolve Political Monitor, which shows a primary vote for Labor of 42%, almost 10% higher than it was at the last election, I think there's a reasonable case to say that he has built on his support in quite a dramatic way, actually, much more so than many would have predicted.
Yeah, and that's interesting what you say about people who would have voted Liberal at the last election being brought over to his side. I think one of the first things that you told Albanese in that interview was that, according to our newspaper's poll, which was published this week, 63% of voters think his government has done a good job over the last year. That's a pretty impressive number. They're pretty big statistics. What was his reaction to hearing that for the first time?
Well, he liked to hear it, that's for sure. He hadn't actually seen it. So 63% support basically for the job of the government 1 year on. I'm interested in your reaction to that number and what you think it might say about I guess, the Australian community's view of your government as you get to the 1-year anniversary?
Yeah, well, it's a very positive outcome.
When I spoke to him, he'd been so caught up with policy work and other things, security briefings and so forth, that he hadn't seen the results. You know, I always assume that politicians see polling as soon as it's out, but not in this case. But he did reflect on it as a sign that he was taking the right approach, I guess. He is getting feedback that's sort of in line with that polling. Of course, all politicians would probably say this, but he says that when he's in shopping centres, people come up to him and say that they didn't vote for him at the last election.
People, a whole range of people, wherever I go, will say, I didn't vote for you, but you're doing a good job and I will next time, is really heartening when that feedback.
And as a Labor factional warrior from years back, Albanese knows that the only people you can really trust are the ones who tell you they're not voting for you. And so when people come up to him in a shopping mall and they say, I didn't vote for you at the last election, but I'm happy with what you're doing and I will vote for you at the next election. Now, he says that's the anecdotal evidence. I can see that he puts a lot of store in that. Mentally, that's what's driving him to make sure that he reaches out, holds the middle ground and keeps some of those former Liberal voters on his side.
Niki, I want to bring you in here. You've been covering federal politics for many years now, and Anthony Albanese himself has been in politics for 27 years. So I wonder if he has surprised you all as Prime Minister. Did you think he'd be as successful and as well liked as he seems to be so far?
Well, I guess I was one of the few, including many of his best friends and the people who knew him best, who actually thought he could become Prime Minister. I believed that the strategy that he pursued when he was opposition leader was the right one. I would look at him and I would think, can I see this bloke as Prime Minister? And I thought, yeah, I think he'd be okay. You know, I could never see Shorten in the role. I always thought Shorten looked a bit sort of awkward and not really himself. But Albanese, I could picture him in the role. And I think it is true, obviously, that he has done a lot better than people expected that he would. But as he tells you himself, and often, and he's right, people have underestimated him all his life. But I also think that on objective measures, he's also performing well. It's not just that he is doing better. I think it's actually that he is doing a good job. He's not pursuing culture wars. He's got his eye on the things that most people consider to be important. He doesn't pretend to be someone he isn't. He's conscientious. He works hard. He's reasonably even-tempered, and he's not up himself. So I think all of that makes him a very likeable character. And I think it's been, quite a long time since people have had someone there that they actually really like and now trust to do the things that he said he would do. I think that's a very important factor.
David, I just want to quickly jump back to you. In terms of policy success on a policy level, what has Albanese achieved in the last year?
Quite a lot. And I will admit to being surprised, actually, at the way in which the new government's taken shape. I've seen new governments run into immense troubles, like when Tony Abbott came in late 2013 and then had the May 2014 budget. Everything changed. It was blocked in the Senate and there were breaches of election promises pretty much within the first year. That's not the case here. And I guess there is an element of surprise that it's so stable and they've worked pretty smoothly through a lot of policies, such as childcare subsidies have been increased, paid parental leave has been extended, there's been more money in the budget for bulk billing in Medicare, they've supported a Fair Work decision to lift the minimum wage, they've made changes to the Fair Work Act on secure work, they have put in place the safeguard mechanism to cut emissions, they've actually legislated a target for emissions by 2030 to 43% target. Now that's the first time that has been done. And that is a major achievement when you think about the sheer grief over 15 years about trying to put in place a law to reduce emissions. They've increased funding for the National Gallery and for some of the creative institutions. They've actually got Penny Wong to China to normalise some of the relationship with China after some pretty vexed times. They've done things that they've promised, like more places at TAFE that are free of fees. They've set up the National Reconstruction Fund, a $15 billion industry plan. They've got some things that are stuck in the Senate, like a housing fund that's about $10 billion. But they've also gone ahead with the AUKUS agreement and shown that they are sort of rock solid on the US alliance and have now put into place the choice on what nuclear-powered submarine to buy. That's all in the space of the first year. And it's a pretty good list, you'd have to say, about what they're doing. And it's the list that Anthony Albanese said to me, basically, when I said, look, there are some people who don't think you're doing enough, fast enough, because, of course, a Labor government always has people who say, look, what about all the things you promised before the election? Why can't you do more? Go faster, go further. But I think it's a measured pace that's actually achieved quite a lot.
It is a full calendar when you talk about it like that. Niki, just getting back to what you were saying before, beyond policy, I want to talk about what the government's strategy has been. It's been very methodical and it strikes me as quite psychological. As I said before, they've wanted to make Australians feel calm and secure again, to avoid scandal and conflict, and even to allow us just to forget about politics for a while and trust in the fact that they're getting on with their jobs so we can get on with our lives. Would you agree with that characterisation, Niki? And if so, how long do you think a strategy like that will last for?
Look, I think that's right. And one of the reasons why people have been able to relax a little bit and, not think or talk so much about politics is that they can see that the government is actually getting on with the job. That, yes, we've got all these really tough issues like restoring, some kind of relationship with China, like dealing with cost of living, but Albanese is going about it in an orderly fashion. I mean, one of his claims to fame, if you like, is that he has restored cabinet processes. Now, that sounds pretty boring, really, and it is boring, but it's what was needed because his predecessors really weren't interested in cabinet processes. They were mainly control freaks who wanted to run everything. He is trusting his ministers to do the job, and so they're going about it in a fairly calm and orderly way. That's not to say that they're invisible, but they're not being intrusive. They're not getting sidetracked by, their own internals. They are, really looking at the issues that most people care about. And they seem to be going about it in a conscientious and competent manner. Now, how long can that continue? Well, who knows? Everybody, or so many people have said every few months the honeymoon is over. And yet the honeymoon continues, even expands. It just keeps growing, it seems, with the government getting ever more consolidated. Now, that could be a function of how hopeless the alternative is, but it also goes to the way that they're going about things. And obviously things are going to go wrong. Like, for instance, a presidential visit might not transpire. And I think that's thrown a few people off track, but not wildly so. And, they will continue on with other things. But it's more when things go wrong, how you deal with them that's important.
You've just made an oblique reference to the opposition there. I'm sure that Anthony Albanese would like us all to believe that this success is down to his personal brilliance as a politician. But how much can we blame him or thank him, and how much can they thank the opposition, which is in disarray? It's no secret the Liberal Party's really struggling. And Niki, you've written that Peter Dutton is Labor's greatest asset. That's a quote from one of your columns. Can you just reflect on the role of the opposition and their disarray in the Albanese success?
Well, I think in that same column I did say that Albanese was Labor's best asset at the same time. So it's the two things combined, because bearing in mind there are always a lot of other choices these days. People don't have to vote for the major parties. They can go to the Greens, they can go to One Nation, they can go to the Teals. So it's not just that the opposition is so bad. I think, Albanese, as I said before, is good in his own right. But Dutton has made absolutely no headway whatsoever. And one of the other quotes that I had in the column was a cabinet colleague pleading with Albanese, please don't kill him, don't kill Dutton, because, he is very useful to Labor because he's doing so badly. When you look at the past year, it is a struggle to nominate a single policy area that Dutton has tackled that would separate him from the Morrison era. And the Morrison era ended in a complete catastrophe for the Liberal Party. So changes needed to be made, and none of them have been made. So I think they are really struggling. He gave a speech in reply to the budget last week, which had a couple of good little ideas in there, but that's all they were, good little ideas. So I think he needs to pick up the pace, and he needs to do a lot more than that, not only to make himself relevant, but to force people to look again at the Liberal Party and think, oh yeah, maybe there is something there that's worth voting for. But at the moment, there isn't.
David, I want to turn to some of the things that this government has done less well. One of the most obvious things is how the voice to Parliament has been handled. Liberal backbencher Julian Leeser says the government has been cavalier with the process for the referendum.
Announced that he just dropped it in his letter to Peter Dutton 2 days ago. The government has been completely cavalier with this process. The orthodox process for dealing with reform in this country is you have a report, you respond to a report, you set up a committee that tries to build consensus. That's what we've done right throughout these processes to get us to this point. But here at the last moment, when it actually counts, we are not providing people with the detail. We are not building, the government is not providing people with the detail. They are not building the support that I...
Can you just remind us where that debate stands right now?
Well, the two camps, yes and no, are pretty much cementing their positions. But what's happening is a gradual fall in support for the yes case over many months. It's kind of a cascading effect. It was in the 60% last year, then fell to the high 50s over summer, then stayed there for a bit, and now we've seen that support for the voice on a yes or no question, like a referendum, has fallen from 58% to 53% over the last month. Now, I don't think that 1 month of data tells everybody to rethink everything about this campaign and what to take to the Australian people at the referendum. However, there's a broader trend, not just in our surveys, but in others. And that shows this steady decline. That should be ringing alarm bells in the government. It should actually be leading, I think, the Yes campaign to be thinking hard about whether they need to make changes to avoid this decline continuing. But I don't think they're at that point yet. I think the government's still fairly confident that it can win this referendum. But I think most importantly, the Indigenous leaders in the Yes campaign, they have their position that have agreed with Albanese. They firmly believe they need a voice not only to Parliament but to executive government. That's a sticking point for critics, but it's something the Indigenous leadership want. And so they're going to stick at it. I think the decision point over the next month or so is whether the warning signs in the polling research, internal and public, become so great that they've got to rethink the question that they take to the Australian people. Once they decided in Parliament in June, it's pretty much cemented all the way to the referendum later in the year. It becomes very challenging to make any changes.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a private member's bill along those lines from Julian Leeser in this coming sitting week. Niki, the voice has been a major focus of the government. So if the referendum fails later this year, what will that mean for Anthony Albanese, and will he be blamed, should he be blamed for its failure?
He will have to shoulder some of the blame, obviously. There will be terrible recriminations in the aftermath if it goes down. And I was just listening to David there, and I agree with him. the most senior Indigenous leaders, the ones who have been at the forefront of this campaign, have held very firmly to what they want. But I think the question that they will have to confront is whether they want it all or nothing. Because the way things are going, the danger is that they will end up with nothing. So for what it's worth, and I declare myself a supporter for the reform, and I have no quibble with the words executive government. But I do think that if that's the sticking point, if that's what brings this down, is that worth it? And why not consider Julian Leese's contribution, which is to legislate for the voice to executive government, to leave all the rest in the Constitution, recognising the voice and the voice to Parliament, but just that one thing, leave it in legislation. Otherwise, the grave danger, I believe, the way things are going, is that it won't get up and then we'll never come back to it.
Could I add one point on that? Because I thoroughly agree with what Niki just said, and I think it highlights the dynamic here. I don't think that Anthony Albanese can make the call on this alone. I've talked to people in the Yes camp and I say, well, look, what's the process for any decision if one has to be made along these lines? And some of the responses are, well, look, that's going to be up to Anthony Albanese. But let's face it, he can only do this with permission from those Indigenous leaders. They have to be able to accept this. And so I don't think that he can sort of just decide we need a different approach. There's no way that Labor could change the proposition on the voice if it's then going to have a backlash from Indigenous leaders who feel that they've been sold out. So the dynamic is incredibly complicated, and it's not like a normal policy where a Prime Minister might be able to get the Cabinet Ministers together and say, we're changing the policy from today. It's not going to be like that.
You can't make a captain's call on this one, that's for sure. David, what other challenges do you expect the government will face over the next few months? We've got the stage 3 tax cuts, which are a little bit controversial. Is there anything else on the horizon that you expect them to hit some trouble with?
I think it's all about the cost of living, but that's going to have many different dimensions to it. It's clearly about inflation. If there is a problem with inflation that continues further than forecast, and we've got problems with interest rate rises by the Reserve Bank, that then could be seen as a verdict on the budget this month and a verdict on the government's inability to get inflation down faster. So there's a lot riding on that, and that's got some time to play out. They've got a housing bill that's stuck in the Senate, so they're not making enough progress quickly enough on actually getting new homes built when we know there's this immense pressure on rents. They've got to show that they've got more results. Clearly by the next election, they've got to have something where they can point to actual action. And there's a connected issue, which is migration. Now, I think that the numbers that Peter Dutton is prosecuting his case on are not quite as solid as he thinks. He's warning about 1.5 million migrants coming in over 5 years. I think the government will actually show a result that's lower than that, but that's the forecast. But I think that's going to take hold in some quarters of the electorate in a way that could be very troubling for the government. And so it's got to get the visa overhaul underway, which is it's already begun under Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill. It's working on it, but it's got to make sure that it actually gets real work done so it can convince Australians at the next election that it's got that issue under control. And that's why I think that issues like stage 3, even though they dominate a lot of debate in the media, aren't as crucial right now. I think there's actual time for the government to consider its options on tax. In fact, I'm tempted to start using a different phrase in the future, which is stage 4. Stage 3 is probably going to take effect because it's already legislated. The question, I think, is emerging in terms of what will Labor take to the next election that might modify taxes, because all the rhetoric from Anthony Albanese is that he doesn't want to break election promises. So I just don't see a scenario at the moment where he amends stage 3 in a way in this term that makes it look like he's broken any election pledges.
Niki, the last 10 or 15 years of Australian politics has been marked by significant turbulence. Some prime ministers have barely lasted 2 years. And as you said before, this honeymoon period for the Albanese government is beginning to look less like a period and more like a sort of epoch. When should we expect this honeymoon period to come to an end? And what do you think might bring it to an end?
Well, I think if the voice referendum is lost, that will be a turning point, because I think it will reverberate around the country and also inside the government, and it will affect Albanese's authority and his standing. So that's one thing that could bring it to a halt. The other is if the economy tips into recession, I think then people will start obviously getting very nervous about what the future holds, and depending on how the government reacts to that and responds to that, whether they think, they're safer in Labor's hands during a recession, or whether they might start looking again at other options. But, there's sort of quite big hypotheticals. Could be anything, could be something we don't even know about. Maybe one of his ministers will fall to a scandal, who knows? But you would think that at some point something will happen and that will end it. But I'm not putting money on it just yet.
Certainly, I'm sure Peter Dutton's prayers tend that way. David and Niki, I want to thank you both so much for such an interesting discussion. I wish we could talk for longer, and I really appreciate you making time today. Thank you.
That was great to talk. Thanks.
It was great. Thank you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong, with technical assistance from Dave McMillan. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jackie Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
This is Neil Mitchell. The most powerful word in the world is why. It's the word on which all good journalism should be based. I love asking it. That's why my new podcast is based on that one word. I'll talk to well-known people, not so well-known people, politicians, police, ask why they did certain things or made certain decisions. The other rule for this podcast, it must be interesting. You can subscribe to Neil Mitchell Asks Why wherever you get your podcasts.